CRMLS is the biggest MLS in the country, and I just attended their webinar for brokers and office managers all about the changes that they plan to implement stemming from this NAR settlement. And the webinar was actually very interesting. There are all sorts of developments that answer questions that we've had ever since we first heard of the NAR settlement. I took notes and I'll go through just the most important points. Now, the tentative date for these changes to be implemented is July 15th. Now, of course, it's tentative, it could change, but for now, July 15th is when the MLS expects these changes to go into effect. The first big change is the requirement of a buyer representation agreement. Now, we've known about this since we first heard of the NAR settlement. Real estate agents that are a member of an MLS must have a buyer representation agreement in place. Now, I've been asked, at what point does a prospect turn into a buyer client that needs to sign this buyer representation agreement? And this was touched on in the call a few times. Basically, what the MLS is looking for is that by the time you do your first showing, by the time you go to open that first property, you should have a buyer representation agreement signed and in place. Of course, the sooner the better. If you're going to work with a buyer and you're inevitably going to have this representation agreement, might as well just get it out of the way and have it signed, but you should have it signed no later than your first showing. But we've known about this. What's even more interesting are some of these measures that the MLS talked about in terms of commission on the buyer representation agreement. So, of course, a buyer representation agreement shows that the buyer is going to pay a commission to the buyer's agent. We know that, right? But that commission should be specific and reasonable, not some phony placeholder number, because agents in theory could put an excessively large number on a representation agreement. And if a buyer sees that, let's say a buyer gets nervous and asks the agent why there's this excessively large or unusually large number. Why is this such a generous commission? Well, a buyer's agent could simply say, oh, don't worry about that. You'll never end up paying that. In fact, the seller or the listing broker, they're going to pay that on your behalf. So just disregard that. Just sign this buyer representation agreement because we have to. It's a rule, so just sign it as a formality. But don't worry, you won't pay anything. MLS wants to prevent that from happening, and I think that's reasonable. Now, of course, that works the other direction as well because, and this is where it gets very interesting, you can't have an unusually low number on there either, because if you put a low number, and we can imagine this in a scenario that's a race to the bottom. Imagine this. Now that we're going to have a requirement for a representation agreement, imagine if agents started advertising a low commission on their buyer representation agreement as an advantage of choosing them over their competition. So in theory, you could have an agent that goes around telling potential buyer clients, hey, look, I'm less expensive than anyone else. On my buyer representation agreement, I only charge 0.5% or 0.25% or some very, very small number so that a buyer feels like, well, they're the cheapest, so I'll just use them. Here's the problem, and this is both clever and terrifying at the same time. The MLS stipulates, now listen carefully because this is important, a buyer's agent cannot receive more compensation from any source that exceeds what is stipulated on the buyer representation agreement. Just to clarify, whatever you put on your buyer representation agreement that the buyer is going to pay, you cannot get paid more than that number. You are setting a limit. And it says from any source, meaning that you can't just put, oh, my buyer will pay 0.5%, but I'll get 2% from the listing broker or 2% from the seller. It doesn't work that way. You are setting the ceiling yourself on that buyer representation agreement. So it's interesting because I'm wondering if this is going to cause problems in the future, but for now, I'm just telling you, these are the latest developments that I heard today. This is as recent and breaking as possible in terms of latest developments for what the changes are going to be. So keep that in mind. Your buyer representation agreement can't be too big or too small because there are going to be problems either way. Okay, now we know that the buyer's agent commission, also known as the cooperating broker compensation, is going to be eliminated from the MLS. It will no longer be published. It will no longer be displayed. There will be no buyer's agent commission, okay? Also, now I should back up and say, when I've brought this up, when people have asked, since we heard about this NAR settlement at first, agents said, well, we'll just write something in the private remarks or in the private comments. Well, here's something else. Agents cannot disclose any amount of buyer's agent compensation. And to go further, just to show you how committed the MLS is to eradicating any mention of buyer agent compensation, they will also restrict agents from, even listing agents, from declaring how much they're charging total. So a listing agent cannot put in the private remarks, hey, I'll just write up a seller credit for 2% of the commission, or they can't make any reference to a buyer's agent commission. But even more, they can't even go one step or 1 degree away from that and say, hey, I'm charging a 5% total commission. Hint, 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 write your offer for 2.5% or half of that, or they can't allude to it by declaring how much the listing broker is charging. So let it be known, the MLS is determined to eradicate any mention of any buyer representation compensation or buyer broker compensation. All right. Now, there is a light at the end of this tunnel. There are workarounds, okay? For one, the buyer's agent commission is not going away. It's not going away. In fact, I at this point, after reading articles about the NAR settlement and forums online, I'm just not even interested in what consumers are saying about this, because they're looking at this the whole wrong way. The buyer's agent commission is definitely not going away. All right. And knowing that, and the MLS knows that, and NAR knows that, and everyone that actually understands brokerage knows this, they know that it's going to be negotiated outside of the MLS, and that's fine. There's no issue. There's nothing in the settlement that prevents that I've heard or that has been conveyed. So agents are simply going to have to communicate outside, publicly displaying the information on the MLS, what the buyer's agent compensation is. It's not going away, just negotiated outside the MLS. Now, here's something else that's another benefit. Seller concessions, right? Seller concessions, and they showed this infographic. Now, again, largest MLS in the country showed that last year, 39% of transactions had a seller concession. What's a seller concession usually? A seller credit. Well, now a seller concession, which is an umbrella term for any time a seller has to make some sort of contribution away from what their original accepted sales price was, now it can include a buyer's agent commission. So while there can be no direct talk about any buyer's agent compensation on the MLS, there is going to be a field for a seller concession. And sellers can offer a concession on the MLS, not a buyer's agent commission. Because remember, a seller concession could be a number of things. And typically, it's a credit. It's a seller credit toward the buyer's closing cost. It's a seller's credit toward repairs. It's a seller's credit for some other sort of item negotiated during the request for repairs or inspection period. Well, that seller credit component now also encompasses the buyer's agent commission, or it can, not necessarily. But like the infographic said, if this happened on 39% of transactions, seller concessions are widely being used. It's just now going to include the possibility of a buyer's agent commission. So you'll see that field now on the MLS going forward once this is implemented in July. There's also going to be a checkbox, a concession field, where you can check yes or no if the seller's willing to consider a concession. So not only can you immediately propose a concession as a percentage of the sales price, or the listing agent, in other words, the listing agent can put that the seller is willing to make a concession of X or whatever that may be. But you can even be more vague than that and have a yes or no. Is the seller willing to do a concession? And that concession could be a credit to your buyer's closing costs, or it could be your commission, your buyer's agent commission. So keep that in mind. That seller concession field is a very helpful and important workaround for the elimination of buyer's agent commission on the MLS. So those are the big changes as it relates to the MLS and their role in the NAR settlement. If you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them. Please leave a comment. Thank you for watching.